Have you ever wondered, what if the storm isn't outside your ship, but already inside your mind? Space feels safe, empty, predictable, cold and silent. But a warp storm, it's not turbulence, it's not radiation, it's something that can twist reality, distort time, and watch you in ways you can't even understand. Imagine this: your ship is cruising along, everything seems normal, and then your instruments start failing. Crew members act strange, time no longer obeys you. Every choice, every thought, becomes part of the storm. And slowly, you realize the terrifying truth: you aren't just surviving the storm. You've become part of it. What if the storm wasn't outside your ship, but already inside your mind? For as long as humanity has looked up at the stars, we have told ourselves a comforting story. We say that space is empty, cold, silent, a vast, indifferent vacuum where danger comes only in predictable forms: radiation, gravity, debris. Things that can be measured, calculated, insured against. We draw maps, we plot routes, we build engines powerful enough to cross distances our ancestors once called divine. And with every successful journey, we repeat the same quiet lie: that the universe is chaotic, yes, but ultimately knowable. A warp storm is what happens when that lie collapses. At first, the name itself feels misleadingly simple. A storm implies weather, turbulence, something violent, but temporary. Something you can go around if you're clever enough, or ride out if you're strong enough. That word was chosen deliberately, because it made the phenomenon sound survivable. Familiar, a challenge, rather than a verdict. But a warp storm is not a storm in any meaningful sense. It does not blow through space. It does not pass. It does not obey fronts, pressure systems, or natural cycles. It does not rage and then fade. It waits. Before anyone ever dared to call it a warp storm, crews used different words. They called it a silence, a bruise in the stars, a wrongness. Instruments would behave perfectly until they didn't. Star charts would align flawlessly right up to the moment they became useless. And the space ahead, space that should have been empty, felt crowded, heavy, as if the void itself had thickened. Veterans would describe the sensation in the same hesitant way, no matter how far apart they were born or how different their languages were. They said it felt like approaching a place where reality had already decided you were not welcome. The most unsettling part was not the danger. Humanity has always understood danger. What frightened the early navigators was the inconsistency. A ship could pass through a region once without incident, and then vanish on the next attempt, leaving behind no wreckage, no signal, no debris. Just absence. Entire routes would be marked safe for decades, then suddenly earn a new annotation: lost contact, presumed destroyed, cause unknown. Not enemy action, not mechanical failure, unknown. That word began to pile up in reports like unburied bodies. Still, we pushed forward. We always do. Because the universe, we insisted, does not care enough to be malicious. Storms do not hate ships. Space does not hunt crews. These were human projections, born from fear and isolation. That was the official position, and it was repeated so often it hardened into doctrine. Any suggestion that something in the void might be actively hostile was dismissed as superstition, stress-induced paranoia, or narrative embellishment. After all, how could a place as vast as space notice something as small as a single ship? The answer, it turns out, is terrifyingly simple. A warp storm is not vast. It is intimate. Those who have survived the outer edges of one, those few who returned with their ships intact and their minds only partially fractured, struggled to explain this. They said the storm did not feel like entering chaos. It felt like leaving consensus. Like stepping out of an agreement everyone else was still following. Physics didn't explode all at once. It eroded, rules softened, certainties became suggestions, and the deeper they went, the more those suggestions seemed to respond. To fear, to memory, to thought. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, even now. Because it suggests that the warp storm is not merely something you pass through. It is something that engages. Something that notices when you arrive. Navigators spoke of a pressure behind their eyes long before alarms sounded. Crew members reported unease before any system registered failure. A sense, not of being watched exactly, but of being acknowledged. As though the universe had glanced up from something infinitely larger, and for just a moment, recognized you. Most storms destroy ships. Warp storms unmake assumptions. They force a question humanity has spent centuries avoiding. What if reality is not a fixed stage, but a negotiation? What if the laws we depend on only function because nothing has challenged them recently? A warp storm is what happens when that challenge arrives. Not violently at first, not dramatically, but patiently, like a crack forming in glass, spreading too slowly to notice until the structure fails all at once. In the cruelest truth, the one buried beneath centuries of sanitized reports and softened language, is this: warp storms do not begin when a ship enters them. They begin when a ship believes it understands where it is going. They say every catastrophe announces itself in advance, if you know how to listen. Long before the first ship was officially listed as missing, long before the term, warp storm, entered navigational vocabulary, there were warnings scattered across history like fragments of a broken transmission. The tragedy is not that these warnings were unclear. It is that they were inconvenient. The earliest accounts did not come from explorers or admirals. They came from people no one was inclined to trust: independent navigators, long-haul freight crews, deep-range prospectors who spent months alone between stars. Their logs were messy, emotional, inconsistent. They spoke of routes that felt wrong, of regions where instruments worked but intuition screamed. Some described losing hours without explanation. Others claimed they had arrived at destinations before they had departed, only to find docking records insisting they were days late. Each report, taken alone, was easy to dismiss. Stress, fatigue, poor calibration, but taken together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to see. One of the earliest documented incidents involved a modest survey vessel tasked with charting a newly opened corridor between two stable systems. The mission was routine, almost boring. The ship departed on schedule, transmitted regular status updates, and then, mid-sentence, went silent. Not an explosion, not a distress call, just an abrupt end, as though the message itself had been cut out of existence. Search efforts were launched immediately, and within hours, the same ship reappeared on sensors less than a light minute from its original trajectory. Engines functional, hull intact, crew alive. The celebration lasted exactly 12 minutes. When the boarding team entered the vessel, they found the crew sitting calmly at their stations, eyes open, hands resting where they should have been. No sign of violence, no sign of panic. Life support systems indicated they had been breathing until moments before recovery. And yet, every member of the crew was dead. Not from injury, not from suffocation. Their bodies had simply stopped. As though whatever animated them had quietly withdrawn. The official explanation cited a catastrophic neurological event caused by exotic radiation. The case was closed, but one detail refused to fit. The ship's internal clocks were wrong. Not malfunctioning, wrong. They disagreed with one another by hours, sometimes days. And the captain's personal log, recorded in their own voice, ended with a sentence that chilled everyone who heard it: "We didn't get lost. We got answered." That line was struck from the final report. Similar incidents followed. Ships returned with crews reduced to fractions of their original number, survivors unable to explain where the others had gone. Some claimed their crewmates had simply stepped through doors and never emerged. Others insisted the missing had been present the entire time, talking, working, laughing, until someone noticed there were too many voices on the intercom. Too many footsteps echoing down corridors that only had room for one person at a time. Medical evaluations were inconclusive. The survivors were labeled unstable. Their testimonies were archived, then forgotten. But there was another category of warning, one far more disturbing. Ships that did not return at all, but continued to communicate. Distress signals began to appear from vessels long declared lost, broadcasting from coordinates that no longer existed. Their messages were fragmented, looping, often contradicting themselves. A crew would beg for rescue, then calmly report everything was fine, then scream that they had never left port. In some cases, these signals were received before the ships had officially departed. Investigators dismissed these as sensor echoes, data corruption, or hoaxes. They had to. The alternative implied that time itself was no longer reliable. By the time the term, warp storm, was formally adopted, it was already a compromise. It allowed officials to group these incidents under a single, manageable label. A hazard, a navigational anomaly, something to be avoided, not feared. Routes were redrawn, warning buoys deployed, protocols updated, and for a while, the disappearances slowed. That should have been comforting. Instead, it was worse. Because it meant the phenomenon was not random. It meant the silence had been listening. The first rule to fail was time. It did not shatter dramatically, not at first. There were no alarms labeled temporal instability, No flashing indicators warning crews that cause and effect were about to divorce. Time simply began to misbehave in small, deniable ways that could still be blamed on faulty equipment or human error. A chronometer would drift a few seconds per hour. A sleep cycle would feel too long, or not long enough. A crew member would swear they had just spoken to someone who, according to the logs, had been off shift for days. Then the discrepancies grew teeth. Ships skirting the outer margins of warp storms began reporting impossible arrivals. Vessels would reach their destination weeks before their scheduled departure window. Dockmasters would argue, point to records, demand explanations. The crews had none. Their journey had felt normal, uneventful, boring, even, and yet the universe insisted they were early, so early that, in some cases, they arrived before the infrastructure they were meant to service had even been built. The opposite happened too. Ships emerged from warp-adjacent routes centuries late, their hulls pristine, their crews confused, stepping into civilizations that had mythologized them as legends or cautionary tales. To the travelers, only days had passed. To the universe, entire eras had died. Languages had shifted. Stars had moved. In one infamous case, a crew was greeted by a memorial statue bearing their ship's name, erected to honor their sacrifice 300 years prior. The captain reportedly laughed, assuming it was a prank, until they recognized their own face carved into the stone, older than they would ever live to be. More disturbing still were the messages. Automated beacons began receiving distress calls timestamped in the future. Perfectly formatted, authenticated transmissions pleading for help from ships that had not yet launched. In some cases, authorities attempted to intervene, delaying departures, rerouting vessels, canceling missions entirely. It didn't matter. The messages still arrived. When the ships were eventually launched, under altered conditions and different crews, they vanished in precisely the way the future transmissions had described. The storm, it seemed, was not predicting outcomes. It was remembering them. Inside affected ships, time fractured internally. Different compartments experienced different durations. A crew member might age years while crossing a corridor, while another remained unchanged. Meals would rot moments after preparation. Wounds would heal, then reopen, then never close at all. Surveillance footage became useless. Recordings contradicted eyewitness accounts, showing events happening out of sequence or simultaneously. Investigators watching the footage later reported headaches, nausea, and an intense sense of déjà vu, as though their own memories were being subtly rearranged to accommodate what they were seeing. The most unsettling accounts came from those who claimed time had not simply slowed or accelerated, but become negotiable. Survivors spoke of moments stretching long enough to think entire lifetimes of thought between heartbeats. Of seconds that felt mercifully infinite, and hours that vanished without leaving a trace. One navigator described watching their own hands move independently, completing tasks they had not yet decided to perform. Another insisted they had died, multiple times, only to find themselves continuing, the universe apparently dissatisfied with that particular ending. Officially, these reports were categorized as stress-induced hallucinations. Unofficially, navigators began to refuse certain routes, no matter the pay. Veterans would grow quiet when temporal drift was mentioned, their expressions tightening in a way that suggested memory, not imagination. Because once time stops obeying, the most terrifying realization emerges. You cannot outrun what has already happened. And somewhere within the warp storm, time was no longer flowing forward. It was circling. At some point, fear stops being abstract. It stops being about missing ships, corrupted data, or temporal anomalies buried in reports. Fear becomes personal the moment the environment begins to respond. That was when the language in the logs changed. Crews stopped describing what the warp storm did and started describing what it seemed to want. The shift was subtle at first, qualifiers, hesitations, phrases like it felt like and as if. But the implication was unmistakable. The storm was no longer behaving like a phenomenon. It was behaving like an audience. The earliest sign was sound. Not noise. Space has plenty of that, but voices. Faint at first, indistinct, easily dismissed as interference or auditory hallucination. Comms officers would report hearing their names spoken just beneath the static, always at the edge of comprehension. Engineers working alone in maintenance shafts swore they heard conversations trailing just behind them, stopping the moment they turned around. The recordings never captured anything unusual. That made it worse. It meant whatever was happening did not care to be documented. Then came the memories. Crew members began recalling events that had never occurred. Or worse, forgetting things that had. Childhood moments resurfaced with impossible clarity, playing uninvited behind the eyes. Regrets long buried returned with surgical precision, accompanied by a crushing sense of immediacy, as though they were happening again. Psych evaluations noted that these recollections were not random. The storm did not dredge up joy. It selected fear, guilt, shame, the emotional equivalents of open wounds. Navigators noticed a pattern. The more anxious the crew became, the more unstable the surrounding space grew. Sensor readings spiked during moments of panic. Corridors seemed to lengthen during arguments, bulkheads pressing inward when voices were raised. In one documented case, a captain ordered a strict emotional regulation protocol: no raised voices, no personal conversations, no mention of the storm. For several hours, conditions stabilized. Then a single crew member broke down in a storage bay, sobbing uncontrollably. Within minutes, gravity failed on 3 decks simultaneously. That was when the idea no one wanted to say aloud began to take shape. What if the storm was listening? Not in the way a predator listens for prey, but in the way a system responds to input. As though fear itself was a signal, broadcast directly into the fabric of whatever this region of space had become. Crews reported that suppressing emotion became physically exhausting, like holding one's breath indefinitely. Thoughts felt louder, harder to contain, and the moment concentration slipped, the environment reacted, lights dimming, walls flexing, instruments shrieking nonsense. Some survivors claimed the storm learned them. It used familiar voices: a deceased parent, a former lover, a crewmate lost earlier in the journey. The voices never asked for anything directly. They didn't need to. They simply spoke truths the listener was least prepared to hear, in tones that implied intimacy, understanding, and patience. The kind of patience that did not mind waiting for a breaking point. Attempts were made to counteract this. Noise generators, sedatives, isolation protocols. None worked for long. The storm adapted. When crews went silent, it grew louder. When they refused to acknowledge the voices, the environment itself began to echo them, through vibrations, through fluctuations in pressure, through the subtle rearrangement of space that suggested words without sound. The most chilling realization came from a ship that managed to partially map its interaction with the storm. The data showed a clear correlation between specific emotional spikes and spatial distortions. Fear caused contraction, hope caused expansion, desperation caused repetition, events looping, corridors doubling back on themselves, escape routes leading straight back to the same sealed door. It wasn't feeding on emotion. It was shaping itself around it. And that meant one thing became terrifyingly clear to everyone trapped within a warp storm. You were not just traveling through it. You were contributing to it. No catastrophe destroys a ship faster than the moment its crew stops believing in one another. The warp storm did not need to force this fracture. It merely applied pressure and waited. Isolation, fear, and the slow erosion of reality did the rest. At first, the breakdowns were subtle: miscommunications, raised voices, small disputes over procedures that had once been unquestioned. The captain's authority, so absolute in normal space, began to feel theoretical. Orders were followed out of habit, not trust. And habit, under the wrong conditions, is fragile. Paranoia found fertile ground. When people began hearing voices, no one could be sure who else was hearing them, or what those voices were saying. A whispered name could be dismissed. A shared hallucination could not. Crews started watching one another for signs of instability: a pause before answering, a distant look, a flinch at nothing. Every human reaction became suspect. Fear was no longer just internal. It was something that might be hiding behind the eyes of the person standing next to you. Sleep deprivation accelerated the collapse. Dreams bled into waking moments, indistinguishable from reality. Crew members accused one another of actions they couldn't remember taking. Security footage contradicted personal recollections. In some cases, it showed events no one recalled at all: arguments that ended in violence, meetings that never seemed to have happened, faces appearing in reflections where no one stood. The inability to trust one's own memory was devastating. The inability to trust anyone else was worse. The storm exploited this uncertainty with surgical precision. When one crew member began to suspect another of sabotage, systems started failing in ways that seemed to confirm the fear. When accusations were voiced, the environment reacted: lights flickering, pressure shifting, bulkheads groaning as though the ship itself disapproved. It became impossible to tell whether the storm was responding to the conflict, or actively encouraging it. The distinction stopped mattering. Leadership eroded next. Captains who tried to maintain strict discipline were accused of hiding information. Those who shared too much were blamed for spreading panic. Any decision, no matter how carefully reasoned, created factions. People began forming quiet alliances, sharing theories in whispers, excluding others, just in case. The ship became a maze of unspoken assumptions and half-formed accusations. Every locked door felt intentional. Every delay felt personal. Then came the first deliberate act of violence. It was rarely planned. Most incidents began as arguments, about routes, about rations, about whether the voices were real. A shove, a struggle, and then, abruptly, blood. The aftermath was always the same. Shock, horror, the realization that the storm had not forced anyone's hand. It had merely created the conditions where violence felt inevitable. Survivors would later insist they hadn't recognized themselves in those moments, as though something else had been wearing their impulses like borrowed skin. Deaths changed nothing. If anything, they made things worse. The presence of the dead lingered. Voices continued, now more familiar. Empty bunks felt occupied. Some crew members claimed the deceased were still working, still speaking over internal comms, still offering guidance. Others began avoiding certain areas of the ship entirely, convinced that someone, or something, was waiting there. Grief became another weapon, another emotional frequency the storm could tune itself to. Eventually, crews stopped asking who could be trusted. They started asking who would break next. And somewhere in the tightening corridors, the warp storm pressed closer, not as an external force, but as a reflection of the unraveling minds within it. By the time anyone realized reality itself was failing, it was already too late to stop it. The breakdown did not announce itself with spectacle. No singular moment marked the collapse of physical law. Instead, the universe began to behave incorrectly. Small inconsistencies crept in, the kind the mind instinctively tries to ignore. Angles that didn't quite add up. Distances that felt longer than they should have been. Gravity that pulled at a slight slant, just enough to make walking uncomfortable, just enough to make you question your balance rather than the environment. Then the rules began to contradict one another. Doors opened into spaces that should not have fit inside the ship. Storage rooms stretched deeper than their external dimensions allowed. A straight corridor would curve gently when no one was looking, depositing travelers back where they started without any sensation of turning around. Some crew members claimed the ship was growing. Others insisted it was folding in on itself. Both groups were right, depending on where, and when, you stood. The human body fared no better than the ship. Injuries behaved unpredictably. A deep cut would close in seconds, leaving no scar, while a minor bruise would spread unnaturally, darkening and swelling as if time had chosen to linger there. People reported feeling their organs shift, rearranging themselves with nauseating subtlety. Heartbeats fell out of rhythm with clocks. Breathing felt optional in some compartments, desperately necessary in others. A few unfortunate individuals began experiencing duplication, hands where there should have been one, echoes of faces reflected in polished surfaces that moved half a second too late. Death, once final and mercifully clear, became ambiguous. Crew members who suffered fatal accidents did not always remain dead. Some stood up moments later, confused but functional, insisting nothing had happened. Others vanished entirely, leaving behind only personal effects and a lingering sense of presence. Attempts to catalog casualties became meaningless. Names crossed off lists reappeared. New names wrote themselves into records no one remembered creating. The concept of missing lost all definition. Worst of all was causality. Actions no longer reliably produced outcomes. A system would fail before anyone touched it. Repairs would succeed before being attempted. Conversations echoed back with responses to questions that hadn't been asked yet. Crew members found themselves apologizing for things they were about to do, seized by an inexplicable certainty of guilt. It became impossible to plan, because the future refused to stay ahead of the present. Those who tried to understand what was happening fared the worst. Engineers, physicists, anyone trained to impose logic on chaos, these were the first to break. Their minds searched desperately for frameworks that no longer applied. Each contradiction felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of the rules they had built their identities upon. The storm did not punish ignorance. It punished certainty. Eventually, people stopped trying to fix things. They stopped documenting anomalies. They stopped asking questions. There was a quiet surrender that spread through the ship, an unspoken agreement that noticing made it worse. That the more attention you paid to the fractures in reality, the wider they became. Survival shifted from problem-solving to endurance. Endure the wrongness, endure the waiting, endure the creeping sense that the universe was rewriting itself around you. And as reality continued to peel away, one horrifying truth emerged. This was not damage. This was exposure. The warp storm was not breaking the rules of the universe. It was showing what existed underneath them. There comes a moment in every warp storm encounter when escape stops being a plan and becomes a superstition. At first, crews cling to procedure. They recalculate routes, cross-reference charts, argue over margins and vectors as if precision alone can bully reality back into compliance. Navigation becomes ritualistic. Coordinates are repeated aloud. Calculations are checked, then checked again, not because anyone believes they're wrong, but because the act of checking feels like control. As long as numbers exist, hope pretends it has a foundation. Then the numbers stop agreeing. Star positions shift between observations. Landmarks that should be fixed drift like thoughts half remembered. Jump points appear, vanish, then reappear slightly altered, as if offended by being relied upon. Attempts to exit the storm's perimeter. Loop back inward, no matter the heading. Engines burn fuel, space stretches, and after hours, or days, or minutes, the ship finds itself staring at the same warped region it tried to flee. The realization arrives quietly, but it is devastating. There is no edge. The warp storm does not surround you. It contains you. This is the point where arguments stop. Where even the most defiant voices fall silent, not from fear, but from understanding. The storm is not a wall to be breached. It is a state of being. A condition the ship now occupies, like an illness that has progressed beyond treatment. Navigation consoles become ceremonial artifacts, glowing symbols of a world where direction meant something. Some crews choose denial. They insist escape is still possible, that persistence will be rewarded. They burn themselves out chasing exits that do not exist, exhausting resources and morale in equal measure. Others swing to the opposite extreme. They abandon all attempts at navigation, powering down systems, drifting in enforced stillness. This too fails. The storm does not require motion to work. Time alone is sufficient, and then there are the choices that do not feel like choices at all. A captain orders a final jump, knowing the calculations are nonsense but unwilling to do nothing. A navigator volunteers to stay conscious during a maneuver no human mind should witness. A crew member opens an airlock not in despair, but in the quiet hope that the storm might accept a sacrifice. None of these actions change the outcome. The storm does not bargain. What it offers instead is clarity. Stripped of options, people begin to see the situation for what it is. Not a crisis to be solved, but a process to be endured. Resistance only sharpens the edges. Acceptance dulls them, just enough to breathe. Survivors later described this phase as the calmest, and the most horrifying, period of their ordeal. Because when hope finally dies, it takes fear with it. What remains is something colder. A lucid awareness of inevitability. It is here, in this stillness, that the storm draws its victims deeper. Not by force, but by invitation, because once you accept that there is no way out, the only direction left is forward. And somewhere ahead, the heart of the warp storm is waiting. The idea that a warp storm has a center feels wrong the moment it is spoken. Storms disperse. They do not converge. They are chaos, not structure. And yet, every crew that survived long enough to compare notes reached the same conclusion independently. The deeper they went, the more coherent the wrongness became. Not calmer, not safer, but focused, as if the storm were not an explosion, but a funnel. The approach to the heart was never marked by instruments. It was marked by certainty. Arguments stopped entirely. Voices dropped. Even the storm's whispers grew quieter, as though whatever had been speaking no longer needed to persuade. Crew members described a sensation of pressure, not physical, but conceptual. The feeling that too many incompatible truths were occupying the same space, and something had to give. Thoughts became heavy. Memories felt crowded. People struggled to hold on to the idea of themselves as separate, discrete entities. Space grew, intentional. Corridors no longer shifted randomly. They guided. Doors appeared where they were needed, not where they belonged. Paths simplified, leading everyone, whether they wanted to or not, toward the same convergence point. No one gave the order to go there. No one needed to. Resistance felt pointless, even childish, like arguing with gravity. Those who tried to turn back experienced something far worse than obstruction. They felt ignored. Their movements lost consequence. They could walk for hours without progressing, trapped in loops. That felt deliberately uninteresting, as though the storm had lost patience with them. Only forward motion retained meaning. Only descent, though there was no physical down, produced change. The message was unmistakable. Understanding lay ahead. Stagnation lay everywhere else. As the heart drew closer, individuality began to blur. People reported thinking thoughts that were not entirely their own. Not intrusive voices this time, but shared conclusions. Someone would speak an idea aloud, only to realize everyone else had already arrived at it. Emotional states synchronized without discussion. Fear faded, not because the danger was gone, but because fear no longer served a purpose. It was being replaced by comprehension. And comprehension was unbearable. The heart of a warp storm is not an object. It is a condition. It is what happens when reality is forced to confront a contradiction it cannot resolve. When too many versions of what should be collide in the same place. Time, matter, memory, possibility, layered, compressed, and stripped of hierarchy. Past and future lose priority. Cause and effect become suggestions rather than laws. Everything that could have happened is happening, and everything that did happen is still happening. The storm is not created by this contradiction. It is created to contain it. This is the truth that breaks people. Warp storms are not anomalies in the universe's operating system. They are pressure valves. Scars left behind when reality survives something it was never designed to process. The universe does not heal cleanly. It folds, compresses, and hides its wounds in places no one is meant to enter. A warp storm is one such wound, still tender, still unstable, still aware. And it is aware because awareness is part of the problem. Consciousness does not merely observe reality. It stresses it. Every thinking mind adds weight to the contradiction. Every observer increases the strain. This is why the storm reacts to fear, to memory, to thought itself. Not because it is malicious, but because it is overloaded. A collapsing structure responding reflexively to pressure, warping around the heaviest inputs it can detect. Which is why ships are drawn inward. Not as prey, as reinforcements. At the heart of the warp storm, the final realization settles over the remaining crew like a suffocating blanket. They were never meant to escape. They were meant to help hold something together. And whatever the universe is trying to contain here, is starting to fail. The storm does not announce its climax with fire or destruction. It does not scream. It waits. And then, when the pressure has been sustained long enough, reality begins to unravel all at once. It starts small. A wall folds through itself. A floor tilts at an impossible angle, a ceiling vanishes for a heartbeat. Then the sensations accelerate. Gravity flips without warning, pulling some crew members toward the deck while leaving others suspended midair. Light fractures, scattering into colors no eye has a name for. Sounds layer atop one another, not as echoes, but as simultaneous events, voices overlapping with alarms that have never sounded, engines whirring that have not been activated. Space itself becomes a palimpsest, each layer pressing against the next until comprehension fails. Time stops respecting sequence. Past, present, and future collide. A navigator's memories of childhood intertwine with moments that have not yet happened, so vividly that she cries out in terror at events that are still minutes away. The captain's last orders repeat infinitely, echoing through the corridors, each iteration slightly altered, until no one knows which version is real, or if any of them are. Bodies betray their owners. Hands reach where no arms exist. Shadows move, independently. The senses fail first, then the mind, and finally the will. Death becomes meaningless. Some crew members vanish entirely, leaving behind only the memory of their presence. Others persist in grotesque duplication, echoing through space like unfinished commands. And through it all, the storm is patient, deliberate. It does not merely react. It communicates, not with words, but through violation, bending the laws that have always seemed absolute. It whispers through space, through gravity, through thought. Every attempt at resistance becomes another opportunity for it to respond, subtly or violently, to the observer's panic, confusion, and despair. The climax is not marked by a bang or a fireball. It is the realization. The storm does not merely break ships. It breaks certainty. It annihilates reality itself for anyone caught within it. For a brief, infinite moment, every law of physics, every assumption about existence, every comforting illusion collapses. And the crew understands the inescapable truth. There is no universe beyond this moment that is safe. It is here, at the apex of chaos, that the storm seems almost sentient. It does not consume in a hurry. It examines. It calibrates. It stretches the boundaries of comprehension, measuring fear, memory, and thought like instruments of its own design. It does not merely destroy. It disciplines. It teaches, brutally, that the rules humans trust are not universal. They are fragile constructs, meaningless under the weight of the storm's logic. And then the ship, or what remains of it, passes through, or fails to. Some crew members disappear entirely, absorbed into the incomprehensible folds of space and time. Others emerge, altered beyond recognition, their minds carrying fragments of knowledge too vast and terrible to articulate. Instruments report readings that cannot exist. Records contradict themselves. The survivors are no longer the same people who entered. Their survival is not triumph. It is a mutation, an endurance test at the heart of a universe that is indifferent but watchful. At last, the climax recedes, not with closure, but with exhaustion. The storm does not vanish. It relaxes its grip just enough to allow consciousness to reassert itself, leaving behind wreckage not merely of metal and circuitry, but of understanding, memory, and identity. And in that silence, the survivors, if they can be called that, realize something more terrifying than the storm itself. Whatever passed through the storm has changed. The storm has left its mark, and it will not stop here. The warp storm has passed, but it has not ended. The universe continues, pretending, ignoring, yet aware. And in the quiet that follows, the unspoken question remains: how many of the truths you hold dear are merely temporary agreements? How fragile is the reality you inhabit, and how patient is the storm waiting to remind you? Panic has a shape inside a warp storm, though it is not the shape of a scream. It is a slow, spreading awareness, a pressure building behind the eyes and across the chest, a recognition that nothing will ever make sense again. By the time the crew reaches the heart, their rational minds have been stripped to raw survival instinct, stripped of hierarchy, stripped of certainty. Decisions are no longer strategic, they are immediate, gut-level reactions to a universe that no longer guarantees outcomes. The storm does not kill in the traditional sense. It reshapes. It reassigns reality. Crews report seeing their own deaths before they happen, sometimes repeated dozens of times. They hear conversations they have not yet spoken. They feel events that have not yet occurred as if their flesh itself were aware of inevitability. And when the moment comes, the moment where everything they have ever known collapses, they experience it in all directions at once: past, present, future, memory, possibility. One navigator described it as a symphony where every note existed simultaneously, clashing and harmonizing in impossible ways. The ship itself became a conductor, vibrating, bending, alive with the stress of contradictions. Walls moved not to block or contain but to accommodate possibilities. Bulkheads opened and closed like lungs inhaling potential. Gravity flared and vanished, timed with emotional spikes from the crew, as though the storm itself were playing with them, learning them, cataloging them for some purpose they could not begin to comprehend. And then the storm reaches its crescendo. Everything, the loops, the voices, the physical distortions, the impossible aging and unogging, the duplication of selves, intensifies. It is not a moment but an experience stretched across dimensions, a pressure that cannot be escaped by running, hiding, or even closing one's eyes. One cannot shield thought from thought, cannot shield reality from observation. The storm has learned the rhythm of fear, of hope, of memory, and it amplifies it. At this point, the crew ceases to exist as individuals. They merge with the pattern. Decisions dissolve. Names are forgotten. The ship no longer contains people, it contains data points, emotional signatures, and memories folded into the storm itself. The boundary between inside and outside disappears. What remains is awareness, pure and indistinguishable from the storm, experiencing existence as it cannot, yet must, be experienced, endlessly, fully, unavoidably. And then, just when the collapse seems absolute, a single, horrifying clarity emerges. The warp storm does not end. It does not recede. It does not pass. It is not something that you survive in the traditional sense. It is something you integrate into. Something that survives with you or through you. Reality has fractured to accommodate itself, and you are now part of that fracture. Escape is meaningless. Resistance is futile. Even understanding is partial at best, because comprehension is only a fraction of the storm's scope. And yet, paradoxically, in that final, omnidirectional awareness, there is a grim lucidity. Pain, fear, confusion, all remain, but so does knowledge. The universe is not absolute. It bends, it listens, it waits, it adjusts, and in that adjustment, in that terrible equilibrium, the storm finds its truth. You are not a victim. You are a variable, and the storm is patient. When the storm finally begins to release its grip, it does so not with fireworks, but with silence. The heart of the warp storm does not explode, does not shatter, does not announce its passing. It simply withdraws, like a tide retreating after a long, oppressive flood. Ships emerge, if they emerge at all, from the center of incomprehensible distortion, their hulls intact but their crews irrevocably changed. Some have survived in body, but memory is partial, fragmented, and unreliable. Days, months, or centuries may have passed, or none at all. The distinction no longer matters. Survivors speak in hushed tones, not because they fear recounting what happened, but because words feel inadequate. There are gaps in their recollections, vast black spaces where events should have been. Some can remember sequences clearly, only to realize that others disagree, and both accounts are equally true. It is as if reality itself has edited their memories, leaving only what is necessary for survival, and nothing more. And yet, despite this chaos, there is a strange, brittle order. The ship functions again, systems restart, lights flicker, alarms reset, instruments respond to commands. The storm has released control, but not entirely. There is a sense that observation continues, subtle, quiet, just beneath perception. A lingering awareness that the ship is being watched, catalogued, remembered. Those who return often describe a world that has not waited for them. Civilizations have moved on, stars have shifted, new governments, new boundaries, new records have replaced the old. Names once celebrated may have been forgotten, others mythologized, and some erased entirely. And through it all, a whisper remains in memory, that the storm is still there, patient, waiting, able to reach again if noticed. It is in this aftermath that the true terror lingers. Survival is not victory. Returning home is not safety. The warp storm is not bound by location or time. It is a condition, a force, a scar in reality itself. Those who survive it carry more than trauma, they carry knowledge. Knowledge that the universe is not impartial, not fixed, not predictable. And knowledge that reality can, and will, bend around awareness. The final question, the one that will echo long after this account ends, is the one every navigator, engineer, and survivor eventually asks themselves. How terrifying is a warp storm, really? The answer is simple. It is patient, it is aware, and it is waiting for you. And so, the survivors return, not to safety, not to certainty, but to a world that continues as if nothing happened. The stars are the same. The ships still sail. Life goes on. But those who have touched the heart of the warp storm know the truth. There is a fracture beneath reality, subtle but persistent, and it carries the memory of every observer, every thought, every fear. Some speak of it quietly, as if uttering its name too loudly could call it back. Others cannot speak at all, haunted by visions, echoes of impossibilities, glimpses of moments that never should have existed. Every reflection, every shadow, every silence feels like a trace of the storm, a reminder that the universe is listening. Even as they try to rebuild, the awareness lingers, the storm does not rest. It waits in patience beyond time, beyond understanding, beyond fear itself. It does not need to act to terrify, it only needs to exist. And every thought of survival, every attempt to measure, contain, or define it, only feeds its quiet awareness. The warp storm is not something you enter. It is not something you pass through. It is something that sees you. Something that remembers you. Something that endures because you are part of it now. And in that final, lingering realization, the universe whispers the truth the survivors cannot escape. The storm was never rare. It was never random. It was always waiting. And now, so are you. The stars seem calm again. But calm is only another kind of patience. Somewhere out there, in the dark, the warp storm waits. Always patient, always aware, always hungry for observation, and it is still coming.